Hello, Dr. James Bogash, expert in health and longevity and creator of Modern Health Myths. And today we're going to talk about cancer risk reduction and surviving from cancer. So cancer survival. And it can be as simple as the foods that you eat. Actually, that's pretty much it. That's the end of the video. But clearly, with there is no question that our choices have an impact on our both cancer risk and survival risk if you happen to be diagnosed with cancer. That cuts across almost every cancer that we know of. Some of those risk factors you may not be aware of, but those are always there. And one of the things that I advocate heavily is the use of nuts. Pretty much across the board, almost every nut out there, both tree and ground nuts, so things like peanuts, have been shown to be beneficial for health. Some more than others, some for different reasons. So macadamia nuts have a very good, for ketogenic type approaches, they're fantastic. The fibers in both almonds and cashews are really good for lowering cholesterol and helping with gut health. Pecans and walnuts, pistachios all have very high antioxidant capacity, so they are all very good. And that's one of the reasons why our cabinet is always stocked with things like pistachios, macadamia nuts, peanuts. I personally, my wife thinks I'm nuts, but I like to eat them in the shell because, quite frankly, it's just a lot of work to get to that little tiny nut. So I'd rather just eat the whole thing, talk about fiber content, but uh, those are typically the nuts that we'll partake in. One of the things that's very important to remember when you're buying nuts, whether they are canned or prepackaged, is no added oils in the ingredients list. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes people make because they think they're doing all kinds of good things, but they buy a can of nuts and it has cottonseed oil or peanut oil or something added in that's going to completely undo all the health benefits of the nut that you think is going to be good for you. So I usually tell people raw is just the safest bet. I don't really care about salted, so if you want them salted, that's fine, but just no added oils when you're taking in any of those nuts on the list. So that being said, I want to move on to this particular study. It looked at both cancer risk and cancer mortality. It was a very large undertaking. They looked at 43 different studies on nut intake and risk of cancer, and 9 studies on mortality, so risk of dying from cancer. So it's a pretty big undertaking to look at all of them. And basically, they found a 13% lower risk with total nut consumption. That's not 13% certainly doesn't sound a lot, doesn't sound like a lot unless you happen to be in that 13% group, but there's no real downsides to this. So certainly 13% is, it's not the only thing we're going to be doing. It's going to be piled on top of other choices. When they looked at getting more specific as far as the types of cancer, they looked at basically 5 grams a day, and in the description I'll kind of put what different, how many nuts that would be for each type of nut and 5 grams. And they found a 3% overall lower risk of heart attack, or I'm sorry, 3% lower risk of overall cancer. Remember, this is for each 5 grams. So if you had, 20 grams a day, that'd be 3 times 4, so 12%. For pancreatic cancer, one of those cancers you don't want to have because we don't have 3 and 5 year survival rates for pancreatic cancer, was 6% lower. In colon cancer, a pretty substantial 25% drop for each 5 grams a day. Probably because it has a lot to do with feeding the gut bacteria and building a healthy microbiome. So that really totally makes sense. When they're looking at, that was again risk. If we're looking at mortality, Overall, 5 grams a day led to a 4% lower risk of dying from cancer. You start adding up those lists or adding up those grams every day, and we're talking about some pretty significant protection against both being diagnosed with cancer as well as dying from cancer. So for me, I always mix in a little bit of dark chocolate, but nuts are a pretty regular part of my day and one of the things that I typically use to snack on. So as always, I'll post a link to this particular study in the description. Make sure you share this video with somebody who you think needs this information, subscribe to the channel, and give the video a like.